Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Had this with this fall day out there, doesn't it feel just right to be back in school? It's like, yes, this is school time. I'm glad you all were here this morning, and I'm happy to be here. I'm really happy to see the CIRI folks. I mean, so for your knowledge, I haven't regretted retiring, but oh my gosh, seeing you, I miss you all very much. So my topic is ANCSA and ANCSA lands, and as Greg said, it has been basically the heart and soul of my adult life and my career. Taking a little bit from Byron's guidance, and wasn't that great yesterday hearing his own personal experiences of how he was led and led himself to a significant leadership role in the construction of ANCSA. I thought there were some, every time I listened to him and others of that time, I learned a little bit more about the backstory of how ANCSA was enacted and what was the decision making that was going on. So I hope you got a little of that too. I'd like to do today, with my 2 hours, to talk a little bit about how I got to the ANCSA story, and my own view of sort of the events leading up to ANCSA. Then talk a little about the structure of the Act itself and some of the provisions that might not seem completely clear on the surface. And then mostly talk about the difficulties of implementation, because ANCSA was a tough thing to create. It was difficult. It was a difficult birth to get it through legislation, but all could have been lost, and many times I thought was going to be lost through the process of regulation, because as you know, legislation is one thing, but you can kill the intent of Congress so easily by how you do regulations. And so for a decade, maybe even 2 decades after the passage of ANCSA, these new native corporations struggled. There were immense struggles to get what was promised in the Act, get the lands that were promised, and get them in the way they were promised, and get the title that we were promised. There were a lot of disputes as between regional corporations regarding 7I. There was just a lot of hurdles that had to be overcome before corporations really could turn themselves to other business investments. So the whole implementation around land and land selection really took the air out of the room in a lot of these corporations, CIRI included, while they struggled to get their feet on the ground. And I was involved in that. I started very young, I thought, at doing some very heavy responsibilities at CIRI, doing all its land selections when I was in 26, 27, 28 years old. And so I spent my first 20 years with CIRI implementing ANCSA and the Cook Inlet Land Exchange, which I'll touch on briefly, and I've asked that you get a little bit of a insert here for your reading pleasure at some other time. I could spend a little bit talking about Section 7I, which of course is very meaningful. Byron talked a little bit about it yesterday, but this is the revenue sharing provision that ANCSA embodies. And then I don't think you can really talk about ANCSA lands and the situation that we have in Alaska now without actually understanding a bit of ANELP, which is the Alaska Native National Interest Conservation Act, Lands Conservation Act, ANELP. ANELP, to me, is an amendment to ANCSA. The conservationists will say it's the greatest conservation piece of legislation in the history of this country, and that may be true, but really, fundamentally, it is an amendment to ANCSA. The concept was embodied in ANCSA, and so much of the Act is actually about fixing things that were in ANCSA. It came 10 years later, than ANCSA, but together those two pieces of legislation really represent what you see now when you look out and look at land status and you know who owns what. It's those two pieces of legislation that are key. So my personal history, I am the daughter of Ben and Bernie Twitchell, and I was raised as a young girl in a small village near McGrath called Takotna, which is where my folks were living at the time. And I'm a product of the territorial school system, giving away my age, but you know that already. First missionaries and then territorial teachers, and at some point our village population dropped too low school-wise, and we lost our school. And so it was at that point my folks decided that they needed to move. My mother would not send her, second and third and fourth grade children off to school, so that necessitated us moving. And so I finished being raised in Oregon and ultimately went to the University of Oregon and got my undergraduate degree in biology with the intent of being a biologist. I've never worked a day of my life as a biologist, as it turns out, because sometimes amazing opportunities happen to you, even if you don't even know they're happening at the time. I remember looking for work after I got back here from college graduation, and I went to an employment service, and here I had this newly minted biology degree, and I had gone to the Fish and Wildlife Service, and I'd gone to the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and you know what? They had a policy that said entry-level positions are in the field. Out in the field, that makes sense. It still is today. But the additional policy was that women couldn't go into the field with men. So there were no professional women in the ranks of either agency, if you can imagine. And that was in 1974. Byron had it like that was 1959. For me, that was 1974 when I came full against gender discrimination, which is something that was like completely new. I thought that all had been taken care of. Women had been burning their bras. It was just like, I was not doing that because I had a little baby and I was, had need for my bras. But so I just thought those things had all been taken care of, and it really took me back. So then I said, well, I've got to find work. I was in the position where I needed work. I couldn't not work, and so I started looking through an employment agency, and I have spent so much time in advanced science and math classes and chemistry classes in high school that I barely learned to type. And when they found that out, the employment counselor said, well, you don't really look very employable. And so I went home and cried. I thought, oh my gosh, my life's ruined. But this Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act thing had happened. It had happened in 1971, and I had enrolled. And it was like, there was a person in the Fish and Wildlife Service who sort of was so sympathetic. He said, I can't break the red tape. I cannot get you hired. You're just exactly what we want, but I cannot get you hired, and I cannot get through this bureaucratic red tape. But he said, go over to Chilista. You come from Chilista, your folks are from Western Alaska. They're going to do a reindeer herding project. This would be perfect for you. So I went over and I interviewed the man who had the reindeer project planned. Yes, come 3 weeks. So we're starting in 3 weeks. Come and you're employed in 3 weeks. So I dutifully show up, and of course the reindeer program is completely gone. The man is not even working at Chilista anymore. But I was pulled aside by the man who was running the land department, and he said, no, we want you. You're not going to do reindeer things, but we have this act. We've got to make these selections. We have 56 villages in rural Alaska that we have to help make these land selections. This was an early in the year in 1974. Those selections have to be done by December 18th, 1974. That was the deadline for those first big rounds of selections. Most of the village corporations had not even really been stood up. The regional corporations were only a couple of years old, and he said, we need all the help that we can to get through this first selection process. So he said, you're going to work in Anxa Lands. You're going to be a land manager. And it was a turning point in my life that will never regret. There is something about keeping your eyes open for opportunity, but there's also something about being at the right place at the right time. Oh my gosh, I mean, it was so fortuitous to be on the ground level. I feel blessed, really, of not only the CIRI and its formation, but just on the whole thing, on the selection of lands and how the whole land selection process rolled out through the next couple of years. Byron touched on it a little bit, but you know, in Chilista in particular, oh my gosh, I mean, the decision was to bring in 3 reps from the village. So of course these are not necessarily corporate people, because corporations have probably not even been formed, or if they'd been formed, they had only been formed on paper. These are just people, leaders in the village, and we brought in 3 from each village, so of 56 villages in Chilista, 3 from each. So here we have, you know, 100 and, you know, whatever, 60, 70 people in. And we literally had classes where we would say, okay, this is a corporation, it has a board of directors, you know, shareholders elect the board of directors. What is land selection? What is an acre? What's title? What's the deed? You know, what does it mean to have title? All of those it was just like ANCSA 101 to people, because particularly in Western Alaska, they were so much more removed from that concept. They were into traditional use and occupancy, and people knew where their fish camps were, where they went to pick berries. They didn't need pieces of paper to tell them all of that, the long family histories and of use and occupancy of land. So this was a completely foreign concept put on a group of people who weren't quite ready and prepared for that. And there was a lot of concern that village corporations throughout Alaska could not make that first deadline because of this whole huge steep learning curve that everybody had to go through. And there were provisions. Senator Stevens was prepared to put in an amendment to extend that deadline if it were necessary, particularly looking at Chilista and its 56 villages. As it turns out, we managed to, with the aid of a computer, which was like, really, a computer? I mean, a lot of us didn't even know what that was. We managed to get the selections in for all 56 villages on time with nary a conflict, because they had overlapping withdrawals. The region that had the most trouble, as it turns out, meeting deadlines, was CIRI. So at any rate, it was a great place for me, and I think that I've never looked back at the missed opportunity to be a biologist. I'm sure that's a fantastic career, and you can do a lot and learn a lot and contribute a lot in that career too. But I just feel blessed with being at the right place at the right time, and the opportunity at first that Chilista gave me, and then 2 years after we got through the village selections, I really felt like, and Byron touched on it, you know, that these corporations early on were all about guys and run by guys, and I got to feeling that at Chilista. I had been through 2 years there, and I was sort of ready to spread my wings, and I thought, you know what, I'm enrolled to CIRI. Cere's my company. I'm going to go find out about that. And I knew they were having troubles with their land selections. The withdrawals were all messed up, and they were in litigation, and there was this big land exchange they were trying to do, and I thought, you know what, I bet you they could use some land help over there. So I went in and interviewed with Karl Mars, who was my first boss there. He ultimately became the president and CEO of Cere, and he hired me on the spot, and Cere has been my home, not only where I've enrolled, but just it's been my native home. That's why I tell people that are in Anchorage and have spent a lot of time outside of Alaska or live in Anchorage and are a little bit removed from Takotna or Bethel or wherever my ancestors are from, you know, Cere became my native home, and so I'm very happy for that experience. So let's talk a little bit about ANCSA itself. By the way, before we move on from personal history, I'd like to say that I attended the first Cere annual meeting. That was another thing for quote-unquote shareholders. Most of us didn't own shares. I mean, maybe there were a few Alaskan Native people who were like, you know, dabbling in equities and the stock market or whatever, but they must have been pretty rare. And young people like myself, you know, the idea of owning stock, you know, that would be years and years and years before that would ever happen. So, but this idea of going to an annual meeting, so I went to the first annual meeting. It was so great. It was at the 4th Avenue Theater, and of course, the admin people and the shareholder relations people had no idea what to expect because this was the first one. So there was one little table that I'm pointing at Betsy because she's responsible for it at Cere, and does a fabulous job with our meetings. But there was just like one little table and that you had to go through and register. And so the line literally went out the door and down 2 or 3 blocks down the 4th Avenue. So you were standing in this long line, 2 or 3 blocks long, on 4th Avenue, ready to get in. And of course, you know, I hadn't come from one of the Cere villages. I mean, there are villages within Cere, and there are people who, you know, come from villages, and primarily on the Kenai Peninsula. But and they knew each other, and the people who had raised in Kenai or wherever, Seldovian and Ilchik, Tayona, they all knew each other. But I didn't know any of these people, and just being an Anchorage, you know, transplant. And it was so funny because walking down, you would hear people stop and greet each other and go, "I didn't know you were Native. I didn't know you were Native."
It's true.
It's right. It's like everybody was expressing such shock to find their friends in the same line. Now me, on the other hand, you know, being in Oregon, whatever, and I was always very proud of my Yupik heritage and my Sami heritage too, for that matter. And we got a little bit of that Byron and from Greg. It wasn't necessarily the case in Alaska. So
yeah. I would, when I went to my first Cere annual meeting, you know, probably years after that, I ran into folks that I knew from high school that I had no idea were Native. You know, it just wasn't something that you talked about. It was weird.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a lot of discovery going on that that morning. And the next annual meeting couldn't be held because there was no quorum. So, you know, it was really tough early on to get the procedures in place. And once Betsy decided that we would give door prizes, that was it. That's right. That's right. And early bird door prizes. Yeah. ANCSA is about, as we heard yesterday, it really is a land settlement. There was a lot of pressure, as Byron described, to do something. So this young state trying to make its land selections and proposing crazy things without talking to local people, building a road to Minto, to open the Minto Flats to sports hunting, where that is a critical area for subsistence hunting for moose for interior Alaska, or damming the Yukon River and flooding I don't know how many villages. Crazy things that the federal government and the state were planning for Alaska. So there was all this pressure about things happening to Alaska. And then, of course, there was the discovery at Prudhoe Bay and the need to build an 800-mile pipeline to, and what those pipeline people faced was basically a situation where 3/4 of the state was claimed by that time by these Aboriginal land claims. So it was an enormous, it may have been Stevens Village, or I don't know where it actually got started, but ultimately the vast majority of this state was claimed through Aboriginal claims by various villages and groups. Which was not going to go away because, I don't know whether you talked about it yesterday, but because of the unique way Alaska came into the Union, these claims were not extinguished. You know, the Treaty of Cession, which is the shorthand term for the actual bill of sale from Russia when the United States purchased Alaska, did not extinguish those claims. And paraphrasing, they basically said, whatever we own, we convey to you. Well, whatever they own wasn't necessarily they owned the land. And then the Statehood Act came along. That was 100 years later. The Statehood Act came along, and it did not extinguish those Aboriginal claims. The way you extinguish Aboriginal claims, and the way it had been done in the United States up to that point, is you get a treaty. And we have all these stories about all these treaties for the American Indians in the lower 48, which many of them, of course, were fraudulent, and many of them were broken as soon as they were entered into. But the purpose of those was to extinguish that Aboriginal claim to land. And what American Indians got in that process was, the commitment for health care and that kind of thing, but it was a bargain and it was a treaty. Well, there were not such things here in Alaska. The United States, thankfully, had never declared war on Alaska Native people. And so those treaties had never been signed here. So that they were claims, they were legitimate claims. So when Secretary Udall, who is a hero in my book. I had the pleasure of meeting him as a very elderly gentleman shortly before he passed away, living in Santa Fe, and I just had to go up to him and say, "You don't know me, but I am so benefited from your courageous decision to put on a land freeze." People howled, the state howled, the industry, mineral companies, oil companies just screamed and howled at him because he put this land freeze on. But, and you know what he said to me? He said, "I didn't know anybody remembered." Oh. And I said, "Oh my gosh." I mean, there was nothing more courageous, I think, that in that whole process than his ability to do, because that was 1966, that was early.
Great big headline on the front page of the Anchorage Daily News.
Yeah.
It's like the same size headline as when the president was killed. It was just amazing.
Yeah, it was huge, huge. And then, of course, there was the discovery in Prudhoe Bay, and what really forced the action is the permits to build the pipeline were frozen. Now that almost put companies like ARCO out of business and whatever, because they had purchased the stuff, it was sitting all over Alaska, up and down the pipeline route, but the permits were pulled until this settlement. So there was and you talk about that kind of pressure, because when you have big money chomping at the bit to do something. There's a lot of pressure, a lot of political pressure. So I appreciated Byron saying at some point this got beyond their control, because these were enormous stakes. I mean, I had to smile when he was saying, well, we were thinking about $1 million, and and then we got really bold and we said $100 million, and it was like, yeah, but it became such a huge, the stakes became so enormous. So what does Congress do? They can't do this in a vacuum. So there was a Senator, Scoop Jackson from Washington, who decided that they needed to do something. And so there was an organization established called the Federal Field Commission. And if you ever find their book, which I was going to bring it and show it to you, but I can't even find mine, called Alaska Natives and the Land, and Their Land. It is the report from this Federal Field Commission. He said, go tell me, are these claims legit? And so this commission was formed. It had high-ranking military men on it. He had people from the federal agencies. And they came up and basically went around the state and produced this big report, Alaska Natives and Their Land. And that report was instrumental in giving Congress, and the Senate in particular, the oomph to be able to get this done. And the provision, it said 4 things, really, if I can remember them, that were so critical. And you live with them today because they became the underpinnings of the Claims Act. They said first, 96% of the resources, natural resources of the state, and the lands and the critters and the fish and the whatever in this state were legitimately used by Alaska Native people. Second, that said that the settlements that have been done before, Byron talked about going to the Court of Claims, the settlements have been completely inadequate. And this idea, and that they have been little pieces of land, like in the Native Allotment Act, where individuals could get 160 acres, or no land at all and just a small amount of money, and that is completely inadequate. It also said that the ability to fish and hunt and use the natural resources even with a settlement, and even if the settlement is in the 40 million acre range, federal lands are still going to have to be used. That 40 million acres is not enough to continue the practice of subsistence. That was going to be the underpinning of the subsistence provision. And then finally it said, for all these lands, paraphrasing of course, for all these lands that you cannot give back, compensation should be paid. And so you can see there and they went on to actually have a lot of the descriptions of the villages, and had the outline of what the regions would be. So you could see at this point in crafting the report, there already was a lot of thought given to what the structure of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act would be. Because you can see obviously by the time it got passed, you can see there were some changes, but nevertheless, the real bones of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, you can see in that report. And that was produced in 1968.
So that formed like the factual basis for the law?
Yes. Yes, it gave the Senate the confidence that they could deal with this with the study done behind them, and because now we're talking about 44 million acres of land and $1 billion.
Do you know whether or not Congress was surprised by this report, or if they really had no ideas whatsoever, or if this kind of fell in line with their expectations?
I don't know. I don't know for sure. I mean, there are some things that are actually before my time, and negotiating and ANCSA is, actually. I know Siri people think like, oh my God, there's nothing before her time. But I was a decade and a half junior to my colleagues like Byron. So I'm sure there were some, but I think it also was, maybe not a surprise, but it was a goal that the actual young Alaska Native leaders reached for, because you heard him say that at first their own desires were very modest in comparison to what was ultimately on the table. And so I think that there probably was some surprise, but there's probably just as much surprise within the leadership community that they had gone from, $1 million to $1 billion. There's a lot of extra zeros in that short of time. I mean, you have to imagine what a sea change it must have been in people's minds.
Margie, were there terms proposed as part of this document? I mean, they found that there were these 4 parts. Where did it go from 100 million, which you sort of described as if you were really stretching for it, to $1 billion?
Well, I don't believe they had that number I don't recall having that number. But I do remember them having the 40 million acre number in that report. But the whole structure about, the 7I and provisions and the for-profit, go public in 20 years, that kind of stuff, that wasn't in it. It was mostly a description of where the villages were, what their use of the land was, and came to these sort of conclusions about what was necessary. Land was, ANCSA was about the land and the money, and one of the things that the Federal Field Commission said was you could pay for lands that were not returned. That number ended up close to $1 billion. Half of that, or 500, little more than half, 500 million of that was to be paid through royalties as the oil was produced off the slope, or where oil was produced, principally. Turned out it was off the slope from Prudhoe Bay. And the rest, the 462.5 million, was a federal appropriation. As it turns out, people thought that would take $1 billion would take a long time to get paid, but it really was it was just a very short time, less than a decade perhaps, just because of the amount of oil coming off the slope when it did start flowing at 2 million barrels a day. So that the compensation part got paid very quickly. Before that compensation came about, though, there was seed money that was given to corporations. Ceres was, its seed money was $32 million, I think, something like that. But even before that, there was sort of organizational money that were given, and I know Ceres' first president was a man named George Miller from Kenai, and he went back to get the check. And it was like a $500,000 check or something like that for Siri. And the story goes that he, flew back from DC with this organizational money that they got to stand up these corporations, flashing his check to the flight attendants. So. Sounds like George Miller. I worked in Ceres royalty, with Ceres royalties over the years in the land department, and managed to get some of those numbers, of those early royalties, into the company, and they got distributed through 7I. And I had worked so closely with him that one of the checks from back royalties came with my name on it. And so I went bouncing down the hallway. Roy was the president, and Bob Roode was in the company then as an executive. And I came bouncing down the hallway and met them, and I said, look at this check. It's got my name on it. It was like $7.5 million. And Bob Roode reached over and he grabbed that out of my hand before I could even finish my sentence. But that's probably the only $7.5 million check I'm ever going to see with my name on it. unless I win the lottery, and I don't play the lottery, so. Anyway, so the money part came pretty quickly. The land part was another story. It was, as I said, it was a bit of a battle to get the land, because, as I said, you don't pass an act of the scope of ANCSA without a lot of regulation to figure out how you do it. For instance, Section 7I is like, 7 lines in, the Act. And it's taken pages and pages and pages of accounting and treatment and agreements to figure out how to do that. But just how do you convey? So how do you convey 44 million acres to 12 regional corporations and 200 village corporations? You got to have a lot of there's got to be a lot of process. Yeah.
Wasn't it true that the Bureau at the time was historically more about management than conveyance, and so they had to figure out their conveyance concept?
It was. You're exactly right. I mean, and then when you got, one of the problems was conveyances by BLM up to that point had been through a process called patenting, where you'd get patent to the land. Well, patent takes forever and ever, even if you're not dealing with 44 million acres. So how was any of this stuff going to be conveyed? We actually had to go get legislation, subsequent legislation, that said when you get an interim conveyance, which was the device that they decided to use to convey before there was patent, because patent would require survey, and that would take 50, 100 years. We got this act passed that said an interim conveyance acts like a patent. So we had to go get that, because this whole process of how do you get the land out, and when you get it out in an interconveyance, what does that mean? Could people, could banks honor that as legitimate title? I mean, there were just a lot of things that had to be sorted through, and you're absolutely right that how to organize even at BLM to deal with each of the regions, and how to staff it up. I mean, it was enormous. Mike Smith, who is a friend of mine, and he was the assistant DNR commissioner for years under Hammond, and worked for Guy Martin, Commissioner Guy Martin. He told me that when he read ANCSA, he read about it and he read ANCSA, actually got it and read it, he was stupefied by the scope of it, that it was so huge. He said it just stunned him, the scope. And when you look at ANCSA and its scope and what it would drive through ANELP with these big conservation units, I mean, it truly was a sea change in this state, and it's what you're going to look at. That's what we're all going to look at, because the land patterns that those two acts put in place are what Alaskans will know forevermore, because they were that encompassing. But yeah, you're right. Lots of organizational things, and then there was a lot of, I would say, not overt resistance in agencies. Sometimes they were overt. Sometimes the Forest Service, for instance, in my view, took a long, long, long time in coming to the conclusion that this was a federal act and it was not going away. There was just a lot of resistance to some of the provisions. It just took people a while to embrace the idea, just like the Anchorage business community or the Alaska business community. It took them a long time to embrace the idea that these corporations were a good thing, that conveying land to Alaska Native people was a good thing. It just took a while. It's you can tell from Byron how far the state had come and how far it needed to go. I remember when Siri got its first positive editorial in the paper. It was we were 20 years old. It took 20 years before there was a legitimate positive statement made about Cook Inlet region in the paper. So it doesn't seem like the world that you live in, does it? Because now there's so much respect for corporations, and there's an understanding that they are really going to become the underpinnings of the economy of the state, the employment, the diversity of jobs, the commitment they have to their shareholders and Alaska Native people and all of that. It was just a very different climate. And all of those things that the companies have earned over the years were just not appreciated at that time. So we have a system in ANCSA of these village corporations and regional corporations, with the village corporations getting, I think the number is 22 million acres of surface lands. The regions would get all of the subsurface. Just as a little aside, there was, in the early negotiations in ANCSA, there was this idea, instead of having regional corporations, different regional corporations owning the subsurface under village surface lands, there was the idea of one big corporation that would encompass all Alaska Native people, and it would own all of the subsurface of this 44 million acres. Wow, wouldn't that be something? And of course, it was, the oil industry who just said, oh my gosh, that is a powerhouse that we don't want. There's been over time, not to put a too cynical a point on it, but there is over time this idea that ultimately if you do these kinds of acts, convey lands to indigenous people, that they ultimately will go into the hands of the non-indigenous society. And I think there was this idea that 44 million acres was just way too much power in a single entity. So that never happened, but that, you could speculate on what a fantastic thing that would be. Yeah. So we ended up with these regional corporations and village corporation structures. And yes?
I'm going to interrupt you really quick. Before we get too far along the road, maybe you could just briefly comment on the tribal piece of this, if any conversation around that, or is it more about corporations, or is there any kind of Aboriginal land title talk or association with that?
Well, I think people viewed the conveyances to the village, the surface estate to the village corporations as fulfilling that need. I mean, that ultimately the settlement was about people, Alaska Native people living in these communities, and that these surface lands, that they would get the title of those surface lands because those are the lands that they traditionally used, was to fulfill that need. But as we know now, with the tensions that we have between the corporate form and the tribal form, that we probably didn't have as good an understanding that was falling short of the mark at that point than we do now. I don't think people didn't constructed that in any malicious way. They just thought they were taking care of it, and it just didn't. And there were people, when the act was finally passed, there were about 600 AFN delegates that got together to pass because they had to vote to approve it.
For ANCSA?
Okay. So there's 600 of them that gathered, and it may have been out here at APU. Yeah, at APU, and to vote. And there was a minority view within that contingent that didn't like the act for this very reason, and felt that there was going to be as much loss as gained. And a lot of it has to do with subsistence, and I do want to touch on that in ANELP because I have a very interesting story on subsistence and how that's all played out.
Margie, I had a question, and I just wanted to make sure I have my numbers right. So 22 million subsurface went to the village.
No, surface.
Surface, okay, surface. And then the corporations had the subsurface, and then the other 22 million?
Well, and yes, it gets divided up to the regions. Now, this is an interesting point. There are some regions that have the village entitlements are encompassed principally under sections 12A and 12B of the Claims Act. 12C deals with regional entitlement. So regions would get their own entitlement. Some of them would. Some of them don't. And you wonder, why is that the case? Chilista, for instance, has no 12C. And I don't think Alaska has any 12C entitlement. On the other hand, Doyon has like 12 million acres of 12C. So how does that happen? Because the original act was based kind of on population. So you shouldn't have these disparities showing up this way, because we know Chilista's got a lot of shareholders and Alaska has a lot of shareholders. So if it were on a population basis, like it was for the village corporations, you wouldn't have this weird thing happening. Well, there is a deal. There are so many bargains within the bargain, the big bargain. You know, ANCSA is a big bargain. It's a big bargain it's a big social experiment that we're living, but it's also a big bargain with Congress. But buried within it, the structure are a lot of other bargains. And one of these is around 12C. Because Arctic Slope had always felt that really the Settlement Act should have been all about them. Because they opposed the formation of the Seri region. I think they didn't appreciate that it is the territory of the Dena'ina, the traditional territory of the Dena'ina, but nevertheless, they opposed Seri. But they really felt that this whole Settlement Act should have been about them because, of course, all the development was going to happen on the North Slope, and their people were the most impacted. And so they were holding out, opposing this whole structure of the settlement. And because they said, you know, we don't have a lot of people, but we need a lot of land up here to subsist. And their carrying capacity is kind of, you know, it's sparse up there, and it's not rich like, you know, southeast. And they said, we cover a lot of territory up here on the North Slope, and we need a lot of territory for our subsistence. So this whole idea where you get your entitlement based on, but we don't have a lot of people. So this whole idea where you get your entitlement based on the number of people you have is not, we don't like it. So the other regions, of course, wanted, you know, they all had to be, I mean, we all had to be in. There couldn't be an holdout. But the other regions also felt that, yes, if there is going to be oil discovered, it's likely on the North Slope. And so maybe if we allowed Arctic Slope to get more land than a per capita formula would allow, and there was some mechanism that they would have to share that with others, well, maybe we'll allow that kind of formula. And so now you have the situation where Arctic Slope gets to have a 12C entitlement, Doyon, you know, basically the whole center of the state with not that many villages, gets 12 million acres. Seri falls right in the middle. We have a 12C entitlement. But Chilista, which is the region isn't, there's Chilista right there. Welcome, Andrew. So it's got a lot of people, a lot of shareholders, but not that, I mean, in comparison to Doyon, not that big of land base, gets no 12C. But the bargain was the sharing provision, that you would allow regions where there was the expectation that there would be discoveries to have this sort of complicated land formula that isn't based strictly per capita on population, because there would be sharing through the 7I sharing provision. Does it all make sense?
Margie, was there a reason or a philosophy behind splitting the surface and subsurface with the village and the region? Was it just a unique way to tie the villages to the region by separating the ownership of surface versus subsurface?
I think it was, my guess was a lot about the second component of the purpose of the act was not the first was, of course, to clear title, that this is the view of, Congress and whatever, is to clear title. But it was also to provide lands for economic development. And so I think people felt that in these regional structures, and you would have, the resources owned in a regional way, which could help with the development of the resources. And so I think it was, was that kind of thinking. And as Byron said yesterday, they sort of, that I found that variant. That was one of the things that I found very interesting in his comments yesterday, where he said they kind of bought into that. They started talking that way too, that this is going to put more lands in private hands for development, because they knew that that's what the outside community was wanting to hear and could support that concept. And so they said they sort of bought into that and started saying that themselves, that they would put lands in private hands and that it could be developed through these regional structures. It has that village regional difference has been the source of some contention and problems in the past, as you would expect. There is a provision in the Act that does not allow, that sort of guides regions and villages, where regions can't go in wholesale and do developments without permission of the surface owner. There are some protections for that in the Act itself, but it was a source of contention, more so in the past than probably now, because of sand and gravel. Sand and gravel was considered a subsurface resource if it's in commercial quantities. And 7I says if you're a regional corporation, the revenues that you get from subsurface resources or from your timber need to be basically put, and that's net resources, needs to be put into a pot to divvy up. And so there was always this tension. I know in Siri we've had lots of battles over sand and gravel, because here we're in an area where there is a lot of use for sand and gravel, developments happening and whatever, that we would say, as the head of the land department, I can't just give you this because I have this responsibility to share the value of these resources with the other regions, and you can be sued over not doing that. The villages, on the other hand, are going, really, I need to build a road, or I need, this, and so there was a lot of contention over where sand and gravel fit. And it complicated the thing, because the state of Alaska considers it to be the surface, and ANCSA considers it to be subsurface. So it's just one of those little things. But this is why ANCSA, I think, is a powerful instrument, because it can be amended. It is not a treaty, because treaties are impossible to amend. They just can't be amended. We can't even get the U.S. to join the law of the sea, because it takes 2/3 of the Senate, which is just a craziness. We should be in the law of the sea. So it's not a treaty, it's a piece of legislation which can be amended, and that has been good over time. As Byron says, as some of these things started approaching that like the taking all the companies public, leadership was able to get in there and get it fixed. So that's one of the things that got fixed. Sand and gravel now is not a Section 7I shareable resource. And that allows a lot more flexibility for the region to deal with its villages, on that particular subject.
What's the correlation between 14H8 lands and 12C, if any?
It's the 44 million, and then there's the 22, and then you take, then you do all these other 14s, historical sites, cemetery sites, blah, 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 blah. There's a whole package of other 14Hs ahead of 14H8 but nobody knew how much of those they would have to convey. And then at the end of that, whatever's left becomes 14H8, and everybody got 14H8. Did Sea Alaska get 14H8? It may be everybody but Sea Alaska for some reason, but at any rate, so it's sort of it's the plug number that happens to get from the total down to the full conveyances out. And so every region, I don't recall the Sea Alaska situation, but that is why Chalista may not have 12C, but it has a 14H8.
Yeah, I knew that it was, as you described it, where it was. I was just curious under that if the use and intent of that piece of it was functional for others that didn't get it. So
I think it was mostly a plug number. So, but it does serve that purpose, that you can have regions that wouldn't have 12C having some entitlement of their own. Some, but nothing of the scale of like the 12C to Doyon.
Margie, can you maybe talk a little about, unless you were going to anyway, the significance of the recent situation where Siri was able to finally convey the remaining lands to the villages, and I don't know a whole lot about it, but I know there's been contention in the past about that. Can you maybe just touch on
Right,
that?
perfect segue to my next sheet.
Okay.
Because I knew we need to move along. Do people need a break?
Shall we take
No.
a quick 5-minute break? Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, can I get back then? Okay, Tabitha's question was, what about this thing that Siri just did, where it conveyed 12B lands to its villages? And, we're a long ways past 1975 and the deadlines for the selection of 12B, and probably a lot of years past when other villages are getting their 12B selections conveyed to them by BLM. Why is, first of all, it's so late? And why is Siri making the conveyances? This is a job for BLM. That's BLM's responsibility. Well, as I said, implementation of ANCSA was fraught with problems. One of them was the nature, and particularly in Cook Inlet, the nature of the withdrawals. Because, of course, along with a right to select, you had to have an area to select from within. Those were all to be set up. And for most villages, there wasn't the problem. There's a core township, and then you take the townships around your core township, and you take the next row of townships around those townships, and that becomes your withdrawal area. And you're to make your selections from that withdrawal area. Well, if you've got a situation where you have, like Chalista, several villages close together, maybe there's not enough land in those withdrawals. Or if you have a situation in Cook Inlet where you have development already around, state of Alaska taking patent, you have military reservations, you have the Kenai Wildlife It was a moose range then, it's a wildlife refuge now. You have a situation where, because ANCSA didn't undo patents to the state of Alaska, you could select up to a certain amount of land that was selected by the state and tentatively approved to the state. That's their term from BLM, whereas we got the ICs, they have a process called tentatively approved, TA'd lands. You can select a certain amount of those, but that was all. So in Cook Inlet, you got a situation where basically the villages do not have enough land around their village sites to fulfill their entitlement that they were granted under the Claims Act. So what did the government do? They said then, okay, we will do withdrawals, in lieu withdrawals, in lieu of where you're supposed to select, you would take these, or deficiency withdrawals. Sometimes they're called deficiency withdrawals because the lands within your original selection area are deficient in number. So Siri had a lot of this happening with its villages, and because of the nature of everybody else's land ownership. And so there were these deficiency withdrawals basically on the west side of Cook Inlet and up in the Talkeetna Mountains that were designed for those villages to make selections. So the villages went, and with Siri's help, and Chalista, as I said, helped its 56 villages get through the process. Siri did the same, and I suspect all the other regions did the same. They were there trying to help their villages get through those selection processes. So Siri had all the villages in, and they conferred with BLM, and BLM said, yeah, half of you are in this withdrawal, and you got a bunch of villages in this withdrawal, and yes, if you want to go in there and do kind of a checkerboard, as long as the whole thing is compact and contiguous, fine, that's fine. So the villages do that. They have this whole process, rounds, oh my gosh, it's, in fact, it's so funny, when I started at Siri, they had been through this process, and then we had, you didn't have, computer, GIS and all that. So they were just a base map, and then all these overlays of acetate, and each village got a color dot. And so as they went through the rounds, so not one village didn't get to pick everything the best things first. They divided it up. It was a very, very good process. And it was documented with these dots on the map. And so when I first got there, I said, oh, here's the village selection maps. So I rolled them out of the tube and I held them up like this, and it just rained down. It just rained down colored dots. It was like, uh-oh. Did all these colored dots mean something? Luckily, there was a paper record besides just the acetate record. But BLM, in its wisdom, when they got around to adjudicating, which is the term, adjudicating these selections, they looked and they said, oh, yeah, this whole thing is compact and contiguous, but when I look at Tyonek selection, and when I look at Ninilchik selection, and when I look at Chickalhoun selection, they're not compact and contiguous. And the regulations say lands need to be compact and contiguous. Therefore, we reject all these selections on the basis of them not being compact and contiguous, after they had gotten instructions from BLM to make those selections that way. So it was a disaster in the making, with village selections, big chunks of their village selections in their deficiency withdrawals being rejected by BLM after they had been told that was okay. As it turns out, in a few years later, the whole compact and contiguous part of the regulation went away. But that was not until that Siri had again stepped in, and Siri said, okay, here's what we'll do. BLM, and you know, if people knew what they knew now, nobody would ever step in and take over BLM's job. But Siri did, and we said, okay, decision made before my time. BLM, you convey to Siri all of this withdrawal that's been selected. And we will then convey to the villages based on the rounds. And we will then let you know when we've made those conveyances, and you can then check off the village's entitlement.
I think this is one of those examples, as I'm listening to you, Margie, one of those examples that the Bureau was more about management and didn't know how to convey.
Yeah.
And so in this one particular instance, and BB&C has its own history of some of this as well, where we actually defined the step and helped to define that step so that they could learn that process themselves.
Right. So that worked for a lot of the 12As. There was no problem until we got to one particular area where through separate agreements there was a dispute with BLM over whether the villages could take title to those lands or whether they could not. This is part of the you know, a long history of Ceres and its village agreements to sort of adjust entitlements and areas within Cook Inlet. So we had a long simmering dispute with BLM that actually went to litigation for years and years and years. Ceres funded litigation against the Department of Interior saying, no, these lands go to the villages, and BLM and DOI saying, no, those don't go. We ultimately lost in I don't know how many courts, and en banc at the 9th, which is, you know, like they have 3 judges saying no as opposed to 1. And so we finally just said to the villages, this fight it cannot go on. It was holding up the rest of the 12A conveyances. It was holding up 12B because in our situation, you can't convey 12B till you know who's got 12A. That's the priority. That's the priority order of how conveyances go. So if you couldn't do 12A, you couldn't do 12B, and Ceres couldn't finalize its 12C. And so here we are 42 years after the act, and those final entitlements are still not conveyed. And it just, at some point, you just have to stop. And so finally the villages got to the point where they agreed as well, and we stopped the process and slowly began getting the 12A conveyed that we needed to, and ultimately then had to deal with 12B. But because there was so much uncertain about 12A, the villages had really just made a blanket 12B selection. And so Ceres can't convey on a blanket selection. So we had to bring the villages in now, which is like a whole new generation of, like me looking at you, a whole new generation of people going, okay, what's a round, what's a selection, how do we do this? And so they worked, the Ceres Land Department worked with villages, all of this new regime of leadership, got them up to speed on what was going to be required. They went through the process, they found their own way of making rounds, the selection rounds. A selection in rounds, so not everybody got, everybody got a fair shot at what was left. And then ultimately, when that was all agreed to, the deeds were prepared, and Ceres just recently conveyed its 12B lands to the villages. So it was a long and torturous battle, but that allows us now to finalize our 12C, and we can maybe finally put the 100% behind lands conveyed that we are entitled to. Because up to this point we've been going, we're 90% conveyed, which is kind of a rough number, but we could never get to the end until we got through this village process.
And the land represents value, right? It's what banks could loan against, or You know, it could be sold if the village decided to do that. So it really represents a significant amount of value going to the villages that took 42 years to be transferred.
Yeah. So it was a big deal. It's just but it's one of those. It was a gesture of generosity and concern and compassion and whatever for the villages of Siri to sort of figure out a way for them to not lose those entitlements. But it ended up over time just taking way too much time, and so we're happy to have it done. And speaking of litigation, I think before I move to ANELP, I'm kind of watching the clock back here, I do want to talk about some of the other impediments and the difficulties in implementation. There was this whole thing about what kind of title do you get, and do you wait for a patent, and do you have to go, we had to go get legislation to get an interim conveyance. There was an organization that's set up called the Alaska Native Claims Appeal Board. If you have a dispute with BLM, you go to IBLA, the Interior Board of Land Appeals. Well, this is, 44 million acres going out. There's bound to be appeals and disputes over whether you're getting the right thing and whether you're getting it in the right form and fashion. So there was an organization set up to adjudicate those. But ultimately, in the end, we had to kill the thing because it was worse than IBLA. It was just it just was the worst thing. So every decision, and I will not name who led the thing, but because she's still in the country here, but so you'd get this decision. The first thing you'd get from BLM is called a decision to interim convey, a DIC. So then it goes through the process of notifying everybody in the world that this thing is going to go out, rejecting all the over selections and other claims to land that they need to reject, and sort of give you the list of the kind of things that are going to be on the deed, the IC when it comes, the restrictions to the deed when it comes. So it's a appealable document. It's a very significant document, these DICs. It sort of begins you on the path towards conveyance, but they need to be watched very carefully because was lots of stuff in those early decisions to interim convey that the Alaska Native people and Native corporations just felt was inappropriate. And when you took it to ANCAB, generally you would get the wrong answer, so you'd end up having to go to court anyway. So finally we just had to just shoot the thing and kill it. So, but one of the things that came out in these early DICs was this whole thing on 17B easements. And I think Chalista had a lead in fighting some of these easements because there was 17B basically says on these big chunks of land they're getting conveyed to Native corporations, there needs to be a way for the public to get through them. And this is the 17B process. So it's this whole thing, they go out to all the agencies and everybody who's got warm blood, I think, and said, okay, these big lands are going to be conveyed to Native corporations, and so where do you want the 17B easements? Well, they were all over the place, places where there weren't trails. They were there were supposed to be places where if you're going on water and coming off water and going on land, you're supposed to have a spot where you could get off between the water and the land and stay. They became campgrounds. It was just ridiculous. And so there was a whole lawsuit where there were many, many litigants, Native corporations joining each other, battling back the whole idea about how broad and how many these 17B easements would be. So we've sort of finally got that contained. That was one of the big problems. And just a variety of different other kinds of litigations that we had to have over time with, first with ANCAB and then going on to, actually going on to court to try to fix. So during those times, I would say when we had those large overarching issues with BLM, there was a lot of coordination between the regional corporations, in particular, advancing these their interests together. So there was a lot of collaboration when those kind of large policy-making kind of problems were happening with what you were actually getting title to. 7I in and of itself was a very, very interesting component. Speaking of litigation, this is the revenue sharing provision that I talked about. Early on, of course, you know, the act, it's very simple. It's just a few lines. It said 70% 70% of your revenues from subsurface or from timber go into a pool. But you know, that is pretty simple. So, but what does that mean? And very early on, of course, Arctic Slope out of the gate started issuing, getting bonuses and issuing leases on the lands on their North Slope. And people were waiting for Arctic Slope to get its lands, and early on they got big bonuses and leases. There was lots of concern about how those were being shared. The Sea Alaska and Chugach, Alaska, cutting timber like mad, and there's lots of concern about how all that was accounted for. So this is the place where regional corporations had sort of took sides against each other, and it was the air was just fraught with litigations against Arctic Slope, against Sea Alaska and Chugach, and you know, all these early revenue streams that were coming in once title started happening. And it became a lawyer's dream. It's just a lawyer's dream. And it became so alarming to the leadership of the Native corporations at that time that they decided that they needed to put some structure around this Section 7I provision so life could go on and you could do your developments and know what your obligations were. There would be penalties, and they're pretty severe, if you frivolously attacked a region because you didn't think they were sharing enough, and they needed some description about what does it mean, is it net revenues? How do you determine net revenues? And so there became a need to negotiate what has become the Section 7I settlement agreement, which the 7 lines in ANCSA became, 130 pages of accounting treatment that ultimately were signed by all of the CEOs, and they bound the regions to this settlement agreement. And it has not, with the exception of sand and gravel, it has not been altered. Nobody fears, nobody wants to undo that because it was so hard to get. And in fact, what happened was the CEOs decided there were so many lawyers and accountants that were in this process that they would never get it done. So they threw them out of the room, took themselves off to Warm Springs, the Kanita Resort in Warm Springs, and just the CEOs themselves sort of hashed out what this would be. And the basis is basically this. Revenues, and I ran the oil and gas department for Syria. I just hated this agreement. I refused to read it. I said, I don't even want to read it, because the theory is revenues are described very, very broadly. They said boot. Anything you get is a revenue for 7I purposes. And against that you can deduct costs, but those were to be described narrowly. So it's designed basically to have its own bias towards sharing and by that very construct. So it is the case that there are significant revenues that have been distributed and are being distributed through Section 7I. So that provision, that sharing provision is working. Series early revenues around oil and gas kept a lot of doors opened because it was so early, because we acquired title for some very fortuitous reasons and great implementation, producing oil and gas fields. And so
She picked those lands. She's being modest now.
right out under the nose of the state of Alaska. And so, you know, I think it works. I mean, I think the sharing provision there is sharing going on. Arctic Slope is providing a lot of revenue now through their alpine field, and NANA with Red Dog, of course, are giving a lot of money through Section 7I. It is not working, however, exactly as I think people had envisioned, because it is a pretty hefty tax on development. And it does, I think, disincent people, native corporations, for developing their own lands, because it is a pretty, and whether there should have been a lower number, I don't know. It just seems that I think if we look at it now, it's probably not playing out exactly as people had envisioned that it would play out. And you know, there are active rules and passive rules in it where a company can go active and actually actively develop its own lands and be able to get those expenses returned to them. But it only really works well if you already have production that you can take those costs against. So a company like Doyon is reluctant to go out and drill its own well on its lands and pay the 7I burden until it has its own 7I revenue stream. So it's kind of like a catch-22. It's like until you can deduct those costs, it's hard to go out and drill a well, or a gas well, when 1 in 10 chances it's going to hit. And so there are some things about the whole provision, I think, that are just not playing out the way it was intended. Whether it can ever be changed, I don't know. Probably not. But as I said, you know, ANCSA is a living document, and it really truly can be changed. It's going to have to be people like you, who are sort of the next generation that are coming along, that will see an opportunity or a need and can get together on a cooperative basis and make changes that need to happen. Yeah, and I had another one back here. Yeah. No, go ahead. Yeah.
So it's interesting to hear this in theory, but I can't imagine how practically it happens. So if Siri was to calculate revenue and then what you're able to deduct for costs, and you know how much you need to share, what's the vehicle? What do you give them money? Who does it go to, and then how is that distributed?
It goes to all of the other regions.
So
And
Siri directly knows where the check is to be cut.
Oh, yeah.
Individual checks.
Send it out. Yeah. Yeah, here's our 7I guru. I said, if I have a 7I question, I'm gonna toss it to Rhonda.
So each corporation
There was, and
is
it,
responsible for
No.
knowing what the calculation is to every
and, right,
corporation.
and
That includes village and regional.
but the way it works is, first of all, there is a requirement for an audit, a 7I audit. So our auditors do a 7I audit, and all of these numbers need to be audited. And then when you get to the point that needs to be distributed, then yes, Rhonda's shop cuts the check to each regional corporation. And you have basically a year to hold the money before, I mean, you know, so there's always some lag time.
Right.
But yeah, the checks go directly from, you know, I sign the, you know, here's your 7I distribution, and it goes to the CEOs of every one of the regional corporations. And you get to keep your own share. Now, all of that is, that is divided on a per capita basis. There is a percentage that is set in stone from the BIA enrollment days that tell you what is the percentage that each region gets. Like Chalista gets a lot. See, Alaska gets a lot, because as I said, they have a lot of shareholders. So everybody, Otna is one of the smaller recipients because they have few shareholders. Then when it goes to the region, then that's section 7I. 7J says, okay, regional corporations, you now take half of that and you pay it to either your at-large shareholders directly, or you pay it to the village corporation where your shareholder is a shareholder. And you pay it to that village corporation. You don't pay it to that individual shareholder. So I'm an at-large SERI shareholder. I don't have a SERI village affiliation. I don't own shares in a SERI village. So my 7I check from SERI comes directly to me as an at-large shareholder. If I was from Tyonek and I had shares in Tyonek, then my share of 7I would be pooled with all the other Tyonek shareholders' shares, and it would be sent to Tyonek, to the corporation. It would not be sent to me directly. So that's 7J, how that's handled.
I always think the 7J provision is fascinating for a village corporation like Bognac, because we have significant timber holdings, and over the years received this 7J payment from Cognac. Thank you so much. But meanwhile, we're literally making millions of dollars in timber development, and we don't have to share any of it with anyone.
Are you volunteering?
It seems kind
Yes.
of like an inequity that, I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, it is one of the things about, first of all, that natural resources are not distributed uniformly around the state. So you're very fortunate that you have those kind of resources, and other villages do not. But that is the construct of ANCSA.
So I think there was always like the assumption, the regional corporation is going to help kind of take care of the village. And I think there's this kind of assumption that villages would never kind of maybe take care of themselves. When you read provisions like 7I and 7J.
And I think looking at the time you have the modern lens of how well you're doing, but when you look at the times and what this report, this Federal Field Commission report said, and what the conditions were like in villages in Alaska and that sort of thing, you can see how people would say, you know what, but there's going to need to be some help here, and maybe they are not, in the position where they can do that. So, village corporate, that's not uniform across the state, but village corporations are coming along too. And there were about 200 village corporations originally. There have been mergers, not so many now, but early on there were mergers, and so there's now only about like 169 of them. There actually was two mergers attempted between regions and their villages. That was allowed too. NANA pulled it off and merged with all of its villages, officially, legally merged the corporations, village corporations and the regional corporations. So all the surface and the subsurface is owned by NANA in a merged entity, with the exception, I believe, of Kotzebue. Kodiak tried it too, wasn't so successful, and there was lots of litigation around it, because of course, when you merge your assets like that, there has to be some understanding about the assets themselves and who's bringing what in and are they getting fair compensation for that merger and all of that. And there was lots of pushback in Kodiak about their attempted merger. So they did manage, I think, to do a few villages, but not all the villages in Kodiak. But there haven't been really efforts to do that, nor have there been a lot of efforts to convey lands to tribal organizations. There is no prohibition for villages to convey their lands to tribal organizations. And I'm really surprised with the tensions that continue between tribal organizations and just with the resistance to the corporate structure, that there have not been more of those kind of efforts. But there's nothing that prohibits that. It's a much different thing to do it with the subsurface, because then you've got this 7I sharing burden, and that complicates things. So can I spend the last few minutes just telling you a little bit about ANELP? Because I don't want to go beyond my time without sharing what an amazing story ANELP is. And it sort of completes the picture about the land packages in Alaska. There was a section in ANCSA, section 17D2, that says, okay, fine, you're dividing up this land to Alaska Natives through this corporate process, but watching on the sidelines, and maybe not always on the sidelines, were these environmental communities who are very close to the Department of Interior. And of course, the Department of Interior is really negotiating ANCSA on behalf of Congress. And they say, wow, this is an opportunity to divide up this state. If there's going to be a dividing up of this state, we are going to be in this process. So they get 17D2 in there, which says the secretary is to go out and study all the public lands that are left. And there was a category land called D2 lands, and they were going to do 80 million acres of new conservation systems. This is parks, forests, refuges, scenic rivers, etc. 80 million acres. And so they went about studying, and ultimately a bill became gelled and was being worked on, which ultimately became ANILCA, the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act. Largest conservation act in the history of the US. That's what it said. It ended up that there were like 104 acres instead of the 80 acres that were in these conservation units. But what I want to share with you is how I understand those 104 acres came about, and how Alaska Native people had positioned themselves to help fix a wrong in ANCSA. There was early on a provision of subsistence in ANCSA. And Byron didn't touch on, at least when I was here yesterday, didn't touch on it, but there was until the 11th. It wasn't as if people forgot about it. It was there up until the 11th hour and the 59th minute and the 59th second, when the whole ANCSA bill was in conference. And as Byron said, a lot of this stuff was done behind closed doors. And in conference, Senate and congressmen are together trying to iron out the differences in their respective bills to come out with one bill, all behind closed doors. And there was a subsistence provision in there. It wasn't anything like we see now, but it did give subsistence zones to people along rivers, etc. And as I said, was in until the very last minute. But the state of Alaska says that, oh, we can take care of subsistence behind closed doors. And others said, you know what, the federal government of the state of Alaska, we can take care of subsistence. And so the conference committee strikes the subsistence provision. And I think that was the part of the regret that these early Native leaders express about having to sort of take this package or not, the way it came out, because at that very last minute, that provision was stripped. And the committee makes a statement. I mean, I have the statement that says, we will depend on the federal and state government to provide for subsistence for Alaska Native people, or some such thing like that. And whoop, it's gone. So along comes the study for ANELP, studying all the lands. How many conservation units are we going to have? How many more acres than 80 million will we have? But Alaska Native people had gotten very sophisticated politically. And ANELP, the rules in establishing ANELP were the 3 out of 4 rule. 3 parties out of 4 had to agree to a provision before it got put in the ANELP bill. So what are the 4 parties? DOI, the federal government, State of Alaska, and the environmental community, and Alaska Native corporations, or not corporations, Alaska Natives working through AFN. 4 entities. So here is the dilemma. If you want to go beyond what ANCSA allowed of 80 million acres, and you want 100 and whatever million, 130, 140 million acres of conservation systems, you want a conservation system that goes from the Bear's Nose and the Seward Peninsula clear across, with the exception of the pipeline corridor, clear across to the Canadian border, and Yukon Delta Wildlife Refuge of, 26 million acres. If you want those kind of conservation units, they are going to have to be different rules. Or you're going to have the system that you have in the lower 48, where you have only what you need. You have the Yellowstone, and you have Yosemite, and you have these small, discrete parks and refuges. You don't have vast, multi-million acres of conservation systems, but that is what the conservation community wanted, and DOI wanted through their close association with the conservation community. So how do you get that? The state would oppose it. Of course, the state would oppose it. And the 2, conservation community and DOI, are only 2. So where do you get the 3rd vote? You get it from AFN, from the Native community. And what did the Native community say that it needed for this bargain? I mean, they're all bargains. All of these things are bargains. What did they need? They needed Title VIII subsistence. They needed a subsistence provision. They needed no condemnation of native land. They needed ways to access federal land. They needed economic opportunities, the Section 1306s of ANELP, for tourism and administrative units. Those are all new rules. Those are very new rules for these conservation systems. There is condemnation right in the lower 48. You can be condemned out of and they have used it, in fact, condemned out of parks, and obviously they don't have the same kind of subsistence. You can hardly pick nuts off the ground at Walnut Creek, and because to take an animal, heaven forbid. So the whole idea of the way these conservation systems are run now is part of the bargain. It's part of, and then when I give talks to federal agencies, it's like, Native people paid this forward. They paid forward with the vote to say, yes, you can have these big units, but only if you give us new rules. And so that's why, particularly the agencies have to be, I think, always reminded, because you have people coming in from the state, from the regimes in the lower 48 where it's not a familiar concept, and they know, well, how does how does this work? Why does this work this way on our federal lands? It works this way because it was a deal struck. And Alaska Native people paid it forward in order to, and allowed those large systems to be put in place. And so we have them in place with these new rules that we, of course, debate all the time, and we fight, and they don't work perfectly, and whatever. I mean, nothing is perfect in this world. But it was AFN and the leaders of the Alaska Native communities' attempt to get back to a subsistence provision that had been stripped out of ANCSA at the very last moment. So it was, as Byron said yesterday, so clearly, the magnitude was so much that it was, out of their control, but then when it came out, it was really an up or a down, and they had to take what they could at that time when ANCSA was passed, and it took nearly 10 years to get back to a subsistence provision, but that is why ANILCA contains that provision today.
Thank you, Margie.
Any other questions? This, by the way, is this was published in 2006. It was 30-year anniversary of the Cook Inlet Land Exchange. It gives you a little snippet of the gives and the gets within Cook Inlet region and how the region itself struggled with its own entitlements and its village entitlements. So it's for your reading, bedtime reading.
And you're welcome to use that as a source material if you wish on your paper. So.
There's a
All right.
picture of Carl and Roy when they were young.
Yes. Yes. Yes, I would say we were all much younger, and that was the thing that was it's just so fabulous that young people were allowed and took the challenge, to get through the process and deliver to you what you have today and what you're going to make of it in the future. So.
Very cool. Thank you, Margie.